I want you to remember that God's created everything you see. He breathed it into existence. You remember when his people were caught up in slavery? He rescued them. What he did was he parted the sea and he made a way for them, and then he delivered their enemies to them, and he unlocks wombs, and he provides water from a rock, and he provides manna from heaven, and he brought down the walls of Jericho. He froze the sun, allowing victory. He's toppled giants with tiny stones. He's brought fire from heaven. He's shut the mouths of lions. He preserved life in the belly of a well. He's fed thousands with a few loaves. He gives the weak strength. He heals the sick. He's made the blind see, the deaf hear, the mute speak, the lame walk, and he's overcome evil, and he's made a way through death for you and me by the death and the resurrection of his son, Jesus Christ, that we will live with him forever. We will dwell in the house of the Lord forever and ever and ever and ever. What are we afraid of? His resume is flawless. He controls everything. And he loves you.
Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. And it's higher than the mountains that I face, and it's stronger than the power of the grave, and it's constant in the trial and the change. This one thing remains, this one thing remains. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love, and on and on and on and on it goes. Yes, it overwhelms and satisfies my soul, and I never ever have to be afraid. This one thing remains. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love, in death, in life, I'm confident and covered by the power of your great love. My debt is paid. There's nothing that can separate my heart from your great love. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. This one thing remains, this one thing remains.
Good morning, church. My name is Tim Parrish, and I'm the preaching minister for the Huntington Church of Christ. And I'm so glad that you've joined us today for this online worship experience. That's a new expression for us, isn't it? It's not unusual that we would be online. In fact, we've been streaming our worship services for several years through our website and more recently through Facebook. But it seems totally strange to produce content for you and bring a worship service for us to share in together when on a Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, the room I'm standing in is totally empty. Well, such are the times we're living in, and the current crisis is one that we hope won't last forever. In fact, I'm really looking forward to the time when these times are behind us and we can gather again and fill this room. In fact, I suspect that on the other side of this crisis, being in this room together for worship or in other places like this for worship may mean more to us than it's ever meant before. I want to give you some idea of what to expect over the next few minutes. We wanted to try to produce something for you today that would help you to feel the complete worship experience as much as possible, even though you may be watching at home sitting at your kitchen table with your family, or maybe you've got YouTube turned on your living room television, or maybe you're still sitting in your bed and in your pajamas and you're using your mobile device. Whatever might be the case, we want you to participate as much as possible in the worship today. We're going to have several songs that will be spread out throughout the next few minutes. Each of those songs will include the lyrics, and so you can see there on the screen as well as hearing the song. And we not only invite you to sing along, we encourage you, wherever you are, even if it's just you, to sing along with each of these songs, to participate in praising God out loud during this time together. We'll also spend a few minutes in a couple of different segments, opening the Word of God, looking at some probably familiar stories to you, but trying to gain some insight that maybe is particularly helpful and poignant for this particular time in history. We'll also spend a few moments nearer the end of the broadcast today thinking about the Lord's Supper. We'll talk a little bit about what that looks like, and then we'll give you a few minutes of silence in which you, whether you're again alone or with someone else, can participate in sharing the body and the blood of Christ, remembering those precious covenants that we have with Jesus, and bringing ourselves into a time of communion not only with Jesus, but with all believers, with all Christians around the world who are bound together in the body and the blood of Christ. We think that's really important for you to participate in, even if you're at home as well. So this morning, something new, sure. Something meaningful, for sure. And we hope that you will be glad that you've been with us today.
When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows I see billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well, it is well with my soul. Who am I that the highest King would welcome me? I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God, yes I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God, yes I am. Free at last he has ransomed me, his grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God, yes I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God, yes I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am who you say I am. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God, yes I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God, yes I am. Who the Son sets free, is free indeed. I'm a child of God, yes I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God, yes I am.
In Psalm 13, we read some words that sometimes when we hear them confront our ears in such a way that we're not really sure they're words in the Bible. We've been led, so many of us, to believe that we shouldn't say these kinds of things to God, that when we hear someone like David say these things out loud, we kind of pause. We wonder, is that okay? I think we wonder those things because many of us have questions in our minds, especially in times like these. We're not exactly sure what God is doing or exactly how God is going to respond, even though a lot of us in our prayers have been calling on Him to do that very thing. But I want you to listen to these words, because I think from these words, we can take away a framework for processing and dealing with difficult situations in life, whether that's the coronavirus, COVID-19, whether that's a sickness or death of someone that we love, whether it's financial struggle or some other difficulty. I think these words can become words of ours. These can become the way that we can learn to speak to and commune with God. Listen to what David says, beginning in verse 1, again, Psalm 13. O Lord, how long will you forget me? Forever? How long will you look the other way? How long must I struggle with anguish in my soul, with sorrow in my heart every day? How long will my enemy have the upper hand? Turn and answer me, O Lord my God. Restore the sparkle to my eyes, or I will die. Don't let my enemies gloat, saying, we have defeated him. Don't let them rejoice at my downfall. But I trust in your unfailing love. I will rejoice because you have rescued me. I will sing to the Lord because he is good to me. Sounded a little strange, didn't it? That David would go from one extreme of saying, God, it seems like you've forgotten me and that you may forget me forever, to the end of that psalm where David was praising God and talking about singing praises to a trustworthy, unfailing God. Well, I suspect there are a lot of us in this very moment that are somewhere in between those two extremes, and maybe we identify with those early words of David, and maybe we want so much in our hearts to get to that last part of praise. Well, over the next couple of teaching segments, I hope to give you some ideas that I think will help as you work through this and any difficult situation. Stay tuned. Doesn't it kind of seem like the world is going crazy? Like everything we thought we knew about life and about normalcy has kind of been tossed out the window. Constantly on the news, we hear that expression that things may get worse before they get better. And some of you are living through that right now in a very real and personal way. Some of you watching this broadcast are struggling with sickness, maybe wondering if you should be tested. Some of you are struggling in a financial way because this current health scare has caused your job to go away, and you're not really sure how you're going to keep putting food on your family's table. And you look around and you begin to wonder, where are you, God? You begin to wonder if God is the God you thought he was, or if he's doing the job that you thought he was supposed to do. C.S. Lewis once experienced that same kind of feeling. Lewis had already written a book called The Problem of Pain. And in The Problem of Pain, he talked about the biblical reasons for suffering and why sometimes in this life we experienced suffering. But then he met and married the love of his life. It was a little bit later in life for Lewis, and he was so happy. His heart had been opened to love and happiness in a way that he'd never experienced before. And then his wife began to be sick, and then she died. He didn't know what to do because this was a totally new place for him. He felt pain and hurt and grief and uncertainty that he'd never known. And he began to journal. And he wrote down these things from day to day that he was thinking in his heart about the grief and the pain of life and about God and how God responded to that grief and pain. When he finished that journal, he published it. But to be honest, he was a little bit embarrassed. He did not publish it under his own name because he was afraid that people would laugh at him. Here the guy who wrote the book about pain and suffering is now writing a book where it's obvious he didn't know anything about pain and suffering. That little book is called A Grief Observed. And I want to share with you something that C.S. Lewis said, because maybe it's where you find yourself today. Maybe it's the very way you find yourself feeling about God, and you're not really sure that you're supposed to. Lewis said this, "Not that I am, I think, in much danger of ceasing to believe in God. The real danger is of coming to believe such dreadful things about Him. The conclusion I dread is not, so there's no God after all, but rather, so this is what God's really like." Maybe that's kind of how you're feeling now. And you find yourself without the language of Psalm 13. You're in the same place as David. Your heart feels the same. You look around and wonder what God is doing, where God is, and why it doesn't seem like God is responding to the current crisis the way in your heart you think He ought to. Maybe you feel like Lewis as he continues in A Grief Observed. When you are happy, he said, so happy that you have no sense of needing Him. So happy that you're tempted to feel that His claims upon you are an interruption. If you remember yourself and turn to Him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But go to Him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face. The sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. And after that, silence. Do you feel that silence today? Do you feel like you've cried out to God in the midst of this current crisis and it seems as though God hasn't heard you, or it seems as though God hasn't heard the cries of millions upon millions of Christians around the world who have been begging God to end this viral infection? Maybe one of the things that you and I need to do today is to learn to put that into words as we pray, to learn to lament, to learn to express those things to God and not be afraid that God is angry with us or that God is mad at us or that God's going to come get us if we say the wrong thing or if we say it the wrong way. My good friend John Mark Hicks wrote a book where he talked about his own personal suffering. And in that book, he said, lament is my response to suffering. It contains my complaint that God is not doing more, my questions about how long, my demand to have my why questions answered, and my disillusionment with God's handling of the world. It is what I feel. It is my only rational response to suffering. As you look around, as you watch the news, and I hope from time to time you can turn it off, you can mute the noise and not pretend that nothing is wrong in the world, but take a step back long enough to catch your breath. I hope you can find the words to simply express in the first place to God what your complaint is. Don't be afraid as you deal with this to use the words of Psalm 13 or so many of the other Psalms or the words of Job, as Job expressed to God so many questions, so many things that he wanted answers to. That's the first step in learning to lament, is being able to look at God and say, God, I don't get it. God, I don't know where you are. God, I don't know what you're doing. God, this is not the kind of God I thought you were. God, will you forget me forever? Learning to lament in the first place is expressing to God the pain, the anxiety, the uncertainty, the struggles of our heart. And let's not confuse ourselves as though somehow if we don't say it out loud, God doesn't already know what's in our heart. Lament, expressing our complaint to God. In just a few minutes, we'll come back and talk about the next step in lamenting or processing these struggles of our day.
Wonderful, merciful Savior, precious Redeemer and friend, who would have thought that a lamb could rescue the souls of men? Oh, you rescued the souls of men. Counselor, Comforter, Keeper, Spirit we long to embrace. You offer hope when our hearts have hopelessly lost our way. Oh, we've hopelessly lost our way. You are the one that we praise. You are the one we adore. You give the healing and grace our hearts always hunger for. Oh, our hearts always hunger for. Almighty infinite Father, faithful in loving your own, here in our weakness you find us, falling before your throne. Oh, we're falling before your throne. You are the one that we praise. You are the one we adore. You give the healing and grace our hearts always hunger for. Oh, our hearts always hunger for. You are the one that we praise. You are the one we adore. You give the healing and grace our hearts always hunger for. Oh, our hearts always hunger for.
So the first part of learning to lament is using our words, using our language to express to God the complaint of our heart. That's how David begins Psalm 13, by crying out to God and saying, God, I'm not sure where you are, but right now I feel like you have forgotten me and that you may actually forget me forever. And that language is good and it's helpful and it's cathartic and it helps us to really express to God what God longs to have from us, which is what's really in our heart. But we don't stay there. Because if we stay there, all we do is live in darkness and doubt and fear and uncertainty. And God, if anything, is a certain God. So after we express our complaint, after we tell God what it is that we're feeling and we're worrying, the second part of lament is expressing to God what we want Him to do. If we could tell God, God, this is what I want you to do, what would we tell Him? Right now, perhaps we would tell Him, God, if you would do anything that I would ask you, I wish you would just eradicate COVID-19 from the world. Make it go away. Heal all those that are sick. Stop the death and dying from this new novel virus. And let us get back to normal. We see in Psalm 13, that's what David does. Listen as he expresses what he wants God to do. This is in verses 3 and 4. Turn and answer me, O Lord my God. Restore the sparkle to my eyes, or I will die. Don't let my enemies gloat, saying, we've defeated him. Don't let them rejoice at my downfall. The complaint is there, and it's important to express that to God, but then it's important to say to God, God, as someone who believes that you're capable of anything, this is what I would like for you to do. This is what I want you to do. God, this is how I'd like for you to respond to what's going on. Now, some of us are a little unsure about that because the way we've been raised or the way we've thought about God and prayer and faith, we're not really sure that we're supposed to tell God anything. We're not really sure that we're supposed to just say to God, God, here's what I want you to do. And yet again, we return to David, who is a man with a heart like God's. And David was not afraid to say, God, if it was up to me, here's what I would have you to do. Here's how I want you to respond, God, to the current crisis in which I find myself. This is expressed throughout Scripture and other places. For instance, in Psalm 25, David says in the middle of that psalm, turn to me and have mercy, for I am alone and in deep distress. My problems go from bad to worse. Oh, save me from them all. Feel my pain, see my trouble, forgive my sins. See my enemies. Verse 20 says, protect me, rescue my life. Don't let me be disgraced. May integrity and honesty protect me. Jesus used this same kind of formula when he told us as his followers to ask, to seek, and to knock. In fact, Jesus said, ask, seek, and knock. And you'll be given the things that you're asking for. You'll find what you're looking for. And those doors or barriers in front of you will be opened so that you can continue. Well, a lot of us may have trouble believing that. And maybe we don't practice so much of doing what Jesus told us to do by saying, God, here's what I'm asking of you today. Here's how I want you to respond. Right now, God, this is what I wish you would do. It's the same kind of thing that David expresses in Psalm 51. David, confronted with his sinful actions with Bathsheba, is suddenly overcome by what he's done. And he cries out to God. You remember the cry? God, create a new, clean heart in me. He expressed to God what he had done and how it felt. And then he said, God, here's how I want you to act. So secondly, we learn to tell God what we would like for him to do, to ask God to respond in the way that, at least to our eyes, looks appropriate. In just a moment, we'll talk about the third and final part of learning to lament and deal with and process the crises in our life.
Is that his voice I am hearing?
So when we face crisis, when we find ourselves dealing with a situation, maybe not unlike the one we're in right now, a time when everything is out of order and chaos is everywhere, we first express to God exactly what we're thinking and feeling in our hearts. We don't hold back. We don't necessarily accuse God or thrash God, but we don't try to sugarcoat what's in our heart either. So that's part one. Part two is then we call on God to act in whatever way we think we would want God to act. We express to God the complaint of our heart, and then we call God to action. We ask for what we want God to do in the moment. But the third part, and maybe the most important, and maybe the thing that makes parts 1 and 2 work, is that we express our trust in God. We see Him still for who and what He is, and we confess our finite perspective. We confess that it's hard for us to see the world maybe as He would have us to see it. That there's a lot we don't know. In fact, that's what Job's experience in hearing from God in the whirlwind taught him. Job kept telling God, I want an answer. God, I want to take you to court because, God, I look around and I see stuff happening in my life and I don't think I deserve this. And God, this doesn't fit the way I think about you and I think about theology and I think about sin and punishment in the world. And so, God, I need you to give me some answers. And so finally God speaks to Job. And He does it in a whirlwind of all things. I don't know if there's some intentional irony there that it was a great wind that took down the house where Job's kids were. And then the same great wind is the thing from which God speaks. I don't know if it just happens to be that way or if God did that on purpose. But as God begins to ask Job his own series of questions, the thing that Job realizes is that there's a lot I don't know. And I thought I had a pretty good view of the world, and I thought I knew how things worked. And God, I even confess, I thought I knew how you ought to be God. But God, I realize I'm not you. And I see such a small part of the world. And my understanding of even that small part is so limited compared to your great vision of everything. So God, I'm going to have to take a step back, Job said. And though I thought I knew what was going on, and though the Bible tells us that Job didn't sin with his lips when he said these things to God, he confesses to God that he needs to fall down before Him. In essence, saying, God, I need to let you be God because you're really good at being God. The third part of Psalm 13 gives us this same idea. Verses 5 and 6, we read this from David's mouth. But I trust your unfailing love. I will rejoice because you have rescued me. I will sing to the Lord because He is good to me. Job expressed this early on in Job chapter 13, in fact. He says in verse 15, though He slay me, even if through whatever God is doing, He kills me, I will trust in Him. That's a pretty powerful statement, isn't it? And ultimately it's the fact that we can trust God and we're not afraid of God, and we know that God is not sitting around getting ticked off at us, waiting to just thump us off the earth, that enables us to pour our hearts out to Him. It enables us to say, God, this is how I think you ought to act. This is what I think you ought to do. Those are the things, that trust, that abiding, eternal trust in an unchanging, everlasting God. That really is the foundation that holds us steady when the world around us is going crazy. This is expressed elsewhere. Psalm 4 verses 7 through 9 says, you have given me greater joy than those who have abundant harvests of grain and new wine. So in peace I will lie down and sleep. For you, O Lord, alone will keep me safe. Then there is what has become for me one of my favorite passages in these kinds of times. In the book of Habakkuk, the prophet of God is writing to people when things are really bad. And he knows, because God has shown him, they're going to get worse. The city that he thought was the very center of God's presence is going to be taken, and the people that he believed to be God's people are going to be taken away with it. And in that moment, he says this: even though the fig trees have no blossoms and there are no grapes on the vines, even though the olive crop fails and the fields lie empty and barren, even though the flocks die in the fields and the cattle barns are empty, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. The sovereign Lord is my strength. How could he say that? Knowing what was going on and knowing that it in fact was going to be worse for him and the other people around him. It wasn't because he had finally figured out the mysteries of life. It wasn't because he was a prophet and could see that eventually things would be better. It was because he could look at God and say, God, I don't understand all this, but you're God, and I trust you. And even though, using the language of Habakkuk, things were as bad as they could be, even though things were scary and crazy and dark and negative, he says, even through all that, I'm going to sing your praises, God, because you're God, and you're a good God, and we can trust you. So we do. So in this strange season, a season of digital online worship experiences, a season of quarantine, and some strangely unexplainable toilet paper shortage, remember those three things. That when you face the crises of life, you can say to God, God, this is my complaint. This is what I see, and this is how it makes me feel. That you can say to God, God, here's what I'm calling on you to do in response to the current situation. And that you can find in your heart the place of saying, God, I can say this and ask this, because even if it doesn't go the way I want it to, I still will trust in you. You remember those three guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? They wouldn't bow down to the statue of King Nebuchadnezzar, and because of that, they were tossed into the fiery furnace. We maybe learned about them in Sunday school, but a lot of us probably haven't spent a lot of our adult time learning about them or listening to them. But one of the things that happened with them that I think is so profound is when they responded to Nebuchadnezzar. They said in Daniel chapter 3, we believe that our God is going to rescue us if you throw us in that furnace. But even if he doesn't, we're not going to bow down to anybody but him. That's trust in God. Perhaps the trust that we need to have today is a trust that says to God, God, we don't understand this craziness, and God, we're calling on you to drive this illness from the planet. And we trust you, God, even if you don't do what we're asking you to do. Oh, I'm so thankful that you've joined us today. I'm so thankful that you've been with us. I'm so thankful that we have the opportunity to bring this to you today, and hopefully to provide you some kind of help or framework in working your way through this emotionally and spiritually. Perhaps today as you've listened, there have been some questions in your heart and in your mind. Maybe there's just a heaviness. Maybe there is something burdening you right now. And if we were together in this room, this is around the time when we would sing a song and we would give you the opportunity to walk down the aisle and express to someone what your need is. Well, it's a little bit harder to do that today, but we still want to give you that opportunity. So please, if you have a need, we want you to contact us. You can do that via our website. Some of you are watching there today. That's huntingtonchurchofchrist.org. And you can click on Next Steps, and you can notify us of whatever need you might have. You can go to our Facebook page. Some of you are there already. And on the Facebook page, you can send us a message. You can maybe even comment on this post. You can leave comments on our YouTube page, or perhaps you can give us a call at area code 731-986-3686. Whatever your need is, we hope we can be of assistance to you in meeting it.
Just as I am.
One of the most powerful parts about our gatherings each Sunday is when we take a moment to observe the Lord's Supper. You see, whenever Jesus was about to go to the cross and die for our sins, he gathered with his disciples and they had one last supper. And in that last supper, Jesus offered some symbols that represented both his body and his blood with which he was about to give himself for them. In Isaiah chapter 53, starting in verse 3, it says, "He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities, and upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his wounds we are healed." Today we're going to offer another opportunity. If you have the bread and you have the fruit of the vine with you, there's going to be a moment here where you can either pause your video or you could let it play, and there'll be a few minutes for you to have an opportunity and just observe what Jesus did on the cross. It's why we gather each Sunday. It's why we have hope for tomorrow. And in the midst of all of the darkness we face, we know one thing. By Jesus' wounds, we are healed. So in the middle of all of this confusion, one of the questions that we continue to receive is it possible for me to be able to give my contribution online? So I want to go ahead and say yes, online giving is available in two ways. One way is at our church website, the huntingtonchurchofchrist.org, and the second way is Give Plus app. Either one of those you can go to. You can go to the Huntington Church of Christ page, and at the very top of our homepage, there's an opportunity for you to click a link there and give online, as well as downloading the app to the Give Plus app.
You are beautiful beyond description, too marvelous for words, too wonderful for comprehension, like nothing ever seen or heard. Who can grasp your infinite wisdom? Who can fathom the depth of your love? You are beautiful beyond description, majesty enthroned above. And I stand in awe of you. I stand in awe of you. Holy God, to whom all praise is due, I stand in awe of you. And I stand in awe of you. I stand in awe of you. Holy God, to whom all praise is due, I stand in awe of you. Holy God, to whom all praise is due, I stand in awe of you.
We are so thankful that you were able to join us today, and we pray that this has been an encouragement and that it's been uplifting to you. We're so thankful that in the modern day we're able to worship our God together. Even if we're not together in the pews behind me, being able to shake one another's hands and give each other a hug, we're still able to know something true, and that is that our God is very much at work in our world. We're thankful for you, we're praying for you, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks for being here with us.